It's your turn now. If anybody has any questions or would like to make any comment, don't make the comments too long, but feel free to engage with the audience and just tell us who you are as well. That would help.
Hi, Johan speaking. Just one quick question. Do you have any idea on financing all those ideas?
The most common proposal you see is, say, a basic income financed by an income tax. But there are many other ways you can do it that work just as well or perhaps better. You can have a wealth tax. People have proposed a sales or a value-added tax. Those I'm least favorable of because a sales tax has regressive elements. A sales tax taxes the portion of your income that you spend on consumption goods and not the portion that you spend on investment goods. And the wealthier you are, the more you spend on investments instead of consumption, and that tends to be regressive. Actually, income taxes has that problem in some countries, such as mine, where we tax income from capital gains differently from other forms of income and tax capital gains lower than other forms of income, which means that the income that is the biggest source of income for the wealthiest people gets a lower tax rate. I think we should get rid of those problems. But there's other things you can do, such as a tax on the resource value of all of our property. A resource value and the rental value of property is such an enormous source of funds that governments have just been taking control of and then just giving it to the wealthiest people and letting them sell it back to us at a higher price is ridiculous. It's an enormous amount of funds. The government creates money, gives it to the banks, and the banks charges us interest for it. There's billions and billions of dollars in there. The value of the broadcast spectrum. In most countries, the government just declares ownership of it, but then effectively gives it away to corporations for free. The rental value of that is incredible. You wanted to add something?
I think we should start by pointing out Australia is a very low tax country compared to most of the OECD countries, which most people don't realise. And one of the reasons we are one of the lowest tax countries in the OECD is we have one of the meanest and nastiest welfare systems, because we actually have means test things in ways that other countries don't. Means testing means we don't tax people, so, it saves people paying more tax because we means test. It also creates a system which basically stuffs up most of the people on welfare and making them feel like they're rubbish. So, it might be efficient financially, but it's not effective. So, yes, I think one of the reasons, if we got a UBI, I think a lot of people would accept the fact, and you can go into the AES research and have a look at the fact that there's actually not an objection to people paying extra tax, providing they know what we do with it. There's the idea of hypothecated taxes. And I think if you had something like this as a hypothecated tax, which means that the government can't decide to use it for something else, and governments don't like hypothecated taxes, but voters do. I think that we also, that we should actually sort of encourage that, because what's quite interesting when you look at the Scandinavian countries, which are always held up as an example because they actually have much higher levels of taxation, one of the reasons they do is if you have a system which includes everybody, and this is one of the big arguments for universality, that people actually feel an investment in it. The minute you start means testing a thing, then there's all of those people that hire very good accountants to try and get their incomes down so that they can also get it, and fiddle around with it. If we did something about tax evasion, that would also help, in tax avoidance. But the point about it is that we actually need to have a system which people see that they've got an investment in it, and having rich people having an investment in our welfare system means that people are not going to spend most of their time trying to undermine that. I think they're fairly important principles that we need to include. There's a lot of things we could do. If you wanted to fund the age pension and have a surplus on top of it, get rid of all of the superannuation tax concessions. They cost the same as the age pension, and they actually benefit the rich rather than the poor. So if anybody here is under the illusion that they're self-funded retiree, you're not, unless you took absolutely no tax concessions from the government. People seem to think that tax concessions are things you own, and payments are actually things that you're not entitled to. So I think there's a lot of attitude things we can do to shift the tax system so that we can collect a lot more.
Yeah, and I think this answers one of the things you were saying. I don't think basic income conflicts with any of the ideas that Francis brought up, and one of them I think is essential to it is fighting capital accumulation. The taxes that you're going to need to support basic income are things that you can use as a tool to fight that capital accumulation, excessive capital accumulation.
Thanks. So it was good of Eva to get a derogatory comment in against accountants. So I'll put my hand up and say I am one. I apologise.
No economist. I didn't say
You got
anything.
one in just then. I heard it.
Oh, they were the clients of the accountants that go to the accountants to get them to help fix
so
it.
it's not really our fault.
No.
The question I've got is we're all minded towards UBI. We wouldn't be here if we weren't. What's the politically salient point that we can take away from each of you tonight so that we can start talking to people about why this is a good idea? Because as soon as you say it, the Protestant work ethic of you can't give anyone something for nothing comes up. And the best I've heard that I'd add to the mix that we haven't heard about tonight is the current marginal tax rates in Australia for low-income earners are a huge disincentive to work. If you are a single parent and you want to put your children into childcare and you actually want to go to work an extra day a week, going from 3 to 4 days, you'll lose 80% of the money that you would earn. So actually, I think that's, from a fairness argument, one of the strongest arguments. This is an opportunity to do away with some of the worst marginal tax rates we've got. But I'd love to hear the politically salient points because we need to be selling this.
I'm not sure I'm in the selling boat, so I might just defer to my other panellists.
I think on a very basic issue at the moment is basically our welfare system sucks because of the points that you're talking about. We know that it doesn't actually work. It might be efficient, but it's not effective. We are actually stuffing people around because of effective marginal tax rates. We're stuffing them around because of these stupid robo-debt collectors. We're stuffing them around for 5 million other reasons. So I think we can say a UBI is a very good starting point to try and change that. We also have a welfare system at the moment which is going to the dogs even faster because the gentleman called Alan Tudge is busy introducing a cashless welfare card, which is another sort of problem because they're making more and more conditional welfare. So if we want to try and say to people that we want to fix the current welfare mess, we want to stop it becoming more and more conditional because the evidence from all the income management programs in the Northern Territory is that there's no benefit to the people that are a part of that, and yet we're spending a very large amount of money on that sort of things there, that if we want to clean up that mess, it's time we started thinking about the UBI. I know this is not a big grab point, but I think it's a point where sensible people can start thinking about the fact that this is a good way of doing it and actually trying to fix up some serious problems both in the welfare system and the tax system and a lot of other things to create a fairer society. And I think the big thing, which is the thing I ended up on, is if those two in the major parties who are deeply distrusted by the bulk of voters want to be voted for, it would be very useful if they produced something that people saw as something that was socially legitimate and ethical.
The way that I would answer that question is that I would argue that wealth in society is socially created, that we're all invested in, we all contribute to the wealth of a society generally, and whether that's through the unpaid work that we do outside the formal economy, or whether it's through the taxation that we pay that funds research and healthcare, etc., etc. Everybody, every corporation, every business person making money out of a society through their business is only able to do it because of the existence of those structures. And we all share in the creation of those structures. So it makes sense to me that we should all share in the benefits that accrue, the wealth that is created through those. So that would be my grab point on it.
Well, if you want to create a society of these people you're talking to that will bring up this Protestant so-called Protestant work ethic where where everyone has to contribute. If you want a society where everyone has to contribute, you have to take the market economy and throw it in the toilet. Because that's not how capitalism works. Capitalism works by the accumulation of capital, where if you own capital, you don't have to work. Working is optional for the owners of capital, and it is mandatory for everyone else. there are many people who own property, who own investment property, who do work, but they do not have to. That money will work for you, and you never have to work a day in your life. And we have something that's really an affront to democracy. We have a mandatory participation economy for the vast majority of us. And then we have a voluntary participation economy for the small amount of us. And those of us who have to participate, we have to work for those very people who do not have to work. And work we've made synonymous with following someone else's orders. Work is not inherently following someone else's orders. It has become this idea that to work is to go and get a job and take orders out of all day. It has become synonymous with this, partly because we don't count the non-employment things we do as work, but partly because we are prohibited from working for ourselves. We cannot access resources by ourselves to work just for ourselves, to build our own house, to start our own cooperative enterprise. We must be someone else's subordinate. That has nothing to do with any work ethic. That is sort of a subordination ethic, where those of us who don't have property have to be subordinated to those who do and follow orders all day. That is not the Protestant work ethic. That's just feudalism in a new form. And people need to realize that basic income is not about the poor. It is about freeing us all from the dependence on our jobs so we can enter the market as a free person. If you want an actual free market system, a true free market, you have to make people free to say no to that market. Otherwise, you have a forced market economy. Thank you.
My name's Colin Long. I'm the Victorian Secretary of the National Tertiary Education Union. Just to add to that also, I mean, once workers enter the workplace, they effectively abandon all their other democratic rights. And in this country in particular, where there is no real right to strike, you don't even have the right to withdraw your labour. You only have the right to strike during a period of enterprise bargaining, but the rest of the time you don't. You effectively enslave yourself when you go to work. And I would also add that Australia's economy is largely based on the unworked for increment in housing prices, and everyone seems quite happy with that. So there is no real incentive. A large amount of wealth in this country is earned by people who specifically don't want to work for it.
Hi, I'm Josh. I actually host a monthly political action group for basic income in Australia, so if anybody wants to join that, come see me after. Just a little bit. I think I know what the answers are going to be, but can I just get a comparison between basic income and a job guarantee? Just how you feel like the difference would be in applying it. And also, I've had a bit of critique about the possibility of people becoming dependent on government, and that people may lose their agency and power in an increasingly, in a world where owners of capital have more power, basically.
A job guarantee is really the antithesis of basic income. In some ways, it is at least in the context of trying to help everybody. A job guarantee is the idea that if you don't have or can't find or don't like the jobs that are available in the private sector, that you go to your local employment office and they will find a job for you. Now this is something where it could help a lot of people, and if the wages are adequate, it could have some effect in raising wages in the private sector, but it doesn't give you much power to demand a real change, and it also has an enormous overhead costs that are absent from basic income. You've got to set up that system, you've got to set up that employment office in every little town, in every neighborhood of the big city. Then you've got to think of something for people to do, and then you've got to pay someone to give them orders all day and then make sure they do it, and you've got to provide them their tools. So it's a very difficult one. You want to get in on that?
Basically, a good job guarantee is boy stuff. It's the fact that you're going desperate to get a job in case somebody asks you to do the housework. But no, I'm quite serious about the fact that, you know, you will end up with job guarantees which will maybe work for people that have particular things. It won't work for people that have disabilities. It won't work for people who have other sorts of areas which make them less attractive. It really is a desperate attempt to get somebody to do something where you're going to end up sort of painting rocks or doing something equally crappy. I just think, and it also fails totally to recognise unpaid work, and create any sorts of things. So I just think we've got to be very, really careful about the fact that the job guarantee really is a continuation of the status quo, with adding, you know, a sort of a tail end onto it in the hope that somebody's going to end up with something. And I just think, what was the other point that it was in?
Yeah, there's a second, almost entirely unrelated question to the first.
I talked to a politician and he just said,
Oh, becoming dependent on the state. Well, do you want to become dependent? I mean, the thing is, if the idea of a UBI is a universal basic income, which does not do it. I mean, currently, if you're on welfare, yes, you become dependent on the state and you spend most of your time being abused by various people at the Centrelink offices for failing to turn up and do the right thing, or being abused in the streets by people who see you as being on welfare. The advantage of a universal basic income is it goes to everybody, so you can't work out who you have to abuse. I mean, literally, I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be a youngish woman on a disability pension, and she says, and this is a New South Wales point, and I don't know whether it sort of works interstate, that when she's feeling bad about who she is, she doesn't use her disability, the equivalent of the Mikey card, on the buses, the Opal card, because she doesn't want to be identified as somebody on a payment. You get the same thing with other people on that. People are embarrassed about being on payments. If everybody's on the same payment, that gets over that. So tell your friend to get stuffed.
What is the phrase that we have? What is the phrase that we have for a wealthy person who has a big investment portfolio and then draws an income off of that every week or every month? What is the phrase we have for that?
Celebrity.
Independently wealthy. That's the phrase we have for somebody that has enough money so that they do not have to work in the private sector. Independently wealthy. And money buys independence. When you do not have money, then you are dependent on going and getting that money from somebody who has it, because we've created a system where you do not have access to any resources unless you have money. And that, and people recognize that when wealthy people have it. But do you think that what do we call a poor person that then has or an average middle class person who now has access to that same stream of funds that the independently wealthy person has? Oh, you're dependent on that stream of funds. The only thing I'm dependent on that stream of funds is if you take it away, I go back to where we are now. So we're now all below dependence. We're dependent on government, and they haven't ever given us anything. No, I think it's an entirely bogus claim to say that has something to do with dependence. It is about independence.
Hello, hi, it's Rosie. I'm a PhD student. I'm really interested to know about this UBI, that basically we are living in globalized, this neoliberal economy, and it is unprecedented inequalities we are living right now. So my question is, whenever this UBI gonna implement it in the West, what's gonna happen in the South, global South and East? How it gonna affect them? Because it's my personal experience, whatever happens in the West, it is thought so-called big, good, glossy, right thing to happen in the South as well. And these World Bank, IMF, they always go there with these baggage and they just chunk over there, pressed over there, and they say that's the good thing to do, and that is the glorious thing to do in the South. So I'm really worried. It's really fabulous thing. Whenever I was just listening, oh, I will be in equal pay, but it's really worrying thing could be in the South. So what is your idea, what could be, projection happen? Thank you so much.
Well, the global South, the poorer countries have some advantages and disadvantages going for basic income. One is that most of them are so highly unequal that there's a ready tax base. There's a very undertaxed sliver of very wealthy people who could be taxed to make basic income possible. Another is that unfortunately people are so desperately poor at the other end that a much smaller basic income can go a long way. And so they also tend to be poorer countries, and poorer countries you think they could less afford it, but actually in this sense, because there's so much inequality, that there's so much money available from the very wealthy, and a little money goes so far among the many very poor that actually you can have very good and viable basic income in lesser developed countries, and you find there's there's big movements for it in India and Namibia, especially, also in Brazil and some other places. Now, this idea of whatever they do in the global north, people in the global south suddenly think that's the right shining best idea. Sooner or later they're going to wise up, right? I mean, we've tried some really bad ideas in our countries. I would think sooner or later the global south is, maybe we've got to try something different. Maybe we should go first on this basic income thing.
Hi, Nick Rose. I just want to return to this question. It's been mentioned a number of times of inequality, because it seems to me that the basic income debate is really opening up some very big important issues that we need to be talking about as a country. Oxfam in its recent wealth report showed that the richest 8 people in the world now have the same wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion. Andrew Sayer, who was an economist, a British economist, wrote a book a couple of years ago titled Why We Cannot Afford the Rich. And he made the point very compellingly, I think, that far from the American dream that the wealthy deserve their wealth because they've earned it, that in fact in many cases it's inherited, and it's in fact very parasitical. Thomas Piketty spent hundreds of pages documenting the point that Karl Marx made 160 years ago, that accumulation of wealth at one pole is accumulation of misery, toil and suffering at the other, showing that capitalism as a system inevitably and necessarily produces vast inequality and suffering, as well as ecological devastation. So it seems to me you've all kind of touched on this in different ways at different points through the discussion this evening. Arguably, we're living in a neo-feudal economy right now, so the politically salient point might be to take out the pitchforks and get this huge monkey that's crushing us off our backs. But realistically, politically, I think the recent elections in the United States and Great Britain have shown there is a large constituency, particularly amongst the young, for politicians who openly identify themselves as perhaps post-capitalist or anti-capitalist. Bernie Sanders could have been the President of the United States. Jeremy Corbyn came very close to being the Prime Minister of Great Britain on a pretty openly redistributive and arguably democratic socialist platform. Is Australia, after 40 years of market fundamentalism, mature enough now to start having this kind of conversation? Do we need to be thinking beyond capitalism as a system?
Beyond capitalism, yeah, for sure. And I think the technology lends itself to that sort of development as well. But, essentially you're talking about a redistribution issue, and this gets back to the point that I think nearly all of us have raised, that ultimately these are political issues, issues of democracy, etc. I think there's probably a short-term answer to your question and a long-term answer to your question. I think really the short-term answer, and this was reinforced by an IMF report that came out earlier this week, the short-term answer is we need more unionisation. There's an absolute connection between growing inequalities of wealth and diminishment of the power of unions. We need to be able to negotiate better so that the share of wealth going to wages is better than it currently is. So I think that's the very first short-term thing. Longer term, then I think issues around technology come into play. But then again, it's who owns the technology. So issues around ownership of technology come into play. I mentioned earlier the notion of wealth being socially generated. I think this becomes particularly relevant around issues of, this notion, you've probably heard the expression, data is the new oil. This is the thing on which the economy runs. The biggest tech companies in the world rely totally on the creation, well, not the creation, but the ownership and manipulation of data. The interesting thing is most of that data is generated by us for free. So I think we have to, it's not just issues of privacy, it's issues of ownership of that data. We have to start valuing that data and our own labour in producing it. You know, I mean, we produce, take the two biggest tech companies, Facebook and Google. They rely entirely on the fact that we do Google searches or do Facebook posts. We do the labour, and they get all the benefits from it. So I think we're going to have to relook at things like that ownership of data as well. But in the short term, I think more unions.
Look, I hope so. I mean, what feels so remarkable about living in this moment is it feels as though we have lived through a moment where the neoliberal common sense has ended, and we can see the external contours of a system that perhaps was invisible and taken for granted as being the natural order of things just a few years ago. In terms of, you know, the famous quote about, you know, when the crisis comes, people have to reach for the ideas that are lying around. I'd say there's a mixture of old and new ideas lying around that we need to reach for. I think a renewed attention to organised labour and ensuring that people are able to organise and create democratic space in their workplace is an old idea that certainly has not run out of value. Similarly, the idea of building national infrastructure that is services infrastructure as well as manufacturing infrastructure is an idea that is crucial and we should embrace, and that should be highly forward-facing, needless to say. And, you know, ideas that have come out of the Labour manifesto in the UK, Corbyn's agenda around thinking about new varieties of ownership, public ownership, cooperatives, that kind of thing. That debate needs to hit Australia in a far more sophisticated way and be really thought through. But it's worth acknowledging too that we're in circumstances where having these conversations is difficult because we've had 30 to 40 years of atomisation and encouragement to think of ourselves as individuals. And these are fights that can only be won by imagining ourselves in collective, as a collective, and fighting for them together. So that's a sort of muscle memory that's been lost. And when we, you know, in the middle years of the last century had, you know, the greatest level of power as a collective and capital having reduced power, they were in pretty difficult circumstances, right? Wartime, but there were also a sort of set of discursive advantages that came from that, the sense of commonality and common struggle and working together in a particular kind of direction. And, you know, I think a real challenge for our age is to reimagine politics in a way that is genuinely collective rather than thinking of ourselves as individuals, and perhaps a form of politics that often, you know, substitutes kind of emotion and feeling for actual political struggle, which requires cooperation, difficult conversations and compromise. So it's perhaps more challenging than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago.
Can I just add a very quick thing to that last bit, which is why do we have two 70-year-old blokes who are actually pushing those particular viewpoints? We lack leadership in Australia. We lack that sort of sense of somebody coming out of the things there. I mean, they're my generation. We don't, but you know, we actually need to look at the structures we've got, which have killed off that sort of discussion, because I think that the point about it is the younger generation don't know that those sorts of changes are possible. They don't have the utopian vision. And I think we've got to get back to it, because I think we've been killing it off, which is the reason that we don't have that sort of leadership in Australia at the moment, because people are too busy whinging about what we have and actually are not producing alternatives. And I keep trying to do that. This is one of the very few alternatives on the political agenda. And I think if we're serious about change, we've got to get people to do leadership. It's all very well having these groups like a Centre for Australian Progress, having 450 bloody conferences on how to organise. But when you say, what are you organising for? They say helpfully, change. And I say, what change? And they say, oh, that's up to the people. Silence, and nothing ever happens. So I just think we've got to start getting into it by putting up some decent alternatives so people can get that vision, that more utopian vision, that change is possible. Then we'll start getting those things happening. But at the moment, people are not having that. It's like a dead hand with everybody having a good old whinge and a nice demonstration, but no action.
Got one question over here and then one over here, and that will probably be it.
Hi, Jeremy Baskin. I wanted to ask a more prosaic question than the previous speakers. In the imagination of the panel, if you introduced a UBI in the Australian context, what elements of the existing welfare social security system would you imagine being replaced, retained, or changed in deep ways?
I mean, basically, at the moment, I would say that we would actually try and put all of the basic payments up to the pension level, that we would get rid of, as I say, these, if we were offering the things there, I think we would probably start, I've suggested we do start on some of the things there, like getting rid of the particularly nasty things that we've got happening at the moment, which are these highly conditional payments, and start on those sorts of things and move on to the fact that we would actually fix the welfare system. And I think if we can get a UBI that's somewhere around the age pension level and introduce it gradually across various groups, starting with the most disadvantaged, I think we are actually going to fix a lot of those things there. And I think all the extra payments would have to stay there, the ones that are specially targeted to people who have mobility needs and various other things. A lot of them are already universal anyhow. And I think people scaring people by saying, oh, but if we bring in the UBI, we'll lose all of these other things there. I just think that's a sort of weak scare tactics, because actually what we have to do is write the criteria down. And I don't think it's hard. I'm quite familiar with the welfare system, to set it up so that it actually replaces basically what are called the working age payments at a reasonable level. And by the time we actually count in the savings from all of the stupid administration and checking up and various other things like that, we'll find it doesn't cost us very much more, at least to cover the welfare sector. And then we can increase the other taxes in order to cover the rest of the community. And I think it can be done reasonably painlessly over a period of maybe 3 or 4 years.
I just basically agree with that. I think compliance is the big area where there's potential for massive savings and a really kind of major restructuring of the mental architecture around this. So in other words, the unconditionality and universality of the UBI is the thing that makes that possible. But like Eva, I wouldn't want to see access to education and health, etc., lost. And I mean, that's the risk. That's why a lot of people on the left don't like the idea of a UBI, because they see it as not additional to, but replace, the right-wing version is replacing what we have now. And so basically putting all those other services, education, pension, health, into the private sector, and here's your UBI of X number of bucks a month, now go buy those services. I think we've really got to avoid that.
I had a couple of questions. I guess the first is, I find myself thinking when I hear about UBI, I understand it's around pension level, but thinking what's going to happen to prices, because like with the technology we've had to date, we've seen, we've got huge increases in, say, house prices, but we can all afford multiple computers in a way that we couldn't several decades ago. So the relative change in prices is making me wonder, even if we all got a UBI, could we finish up in a situation where we can all afford masses of consumer goods, but the essentials of life, like the roof over our head or the food to eat or our transport, may still be grossly unaffordable? And how do we ensure that, the way I'd see it is, even if everyone were paid a pension, if you were starting out on that now, you're going to be living in a life of poverty, and because you couldn't afford the rent. So how does UBI deal with that? Do we need some kind of price controls? My understanding is we've got speculation happening on house prices, but we've seen that happening with food prices, I think, in third world countries as well. So, yeah, where does that go? Yeah.
I think you can't conflate everything together. I think this is one of the problems. The UBI solves one set of problems. It will not generate any further problems. Those things you're talking about are happening outside the UBI. They're not going to be affected by the UBI, either positively or negatively in any sort of way. And we're talking about people having extra income over and above the UBI in the same way that they would now. And I think we've got to be very careful when we're talking about it, not to expect it to be the panacea for everything, because it's not. It deals with a limited set of things and fixes some of the income stuff. It's not going to fix house prices. That's got to be done separately. It's not going to fix some of the sort of problems of investment type things. It's not going to fix public utilities if we actually claim them back and make them public utilities again, but that's a completely separate question. I just think we've got to be very careful we don't sink the UBI by loading onto it lots and lots of extra things which have got absolutely nothing to do with it. Sorry.
Yes, I agree with Eva entirely on that. I just want to add, to the extent that it has something to do with housing prices, is that in the neighborhoods where people who will be net recipients of UBI live, that is, people who the UBI they receive will be higher than the taxes they pay, then it will probably cause, it will give one reason for prices in those neighborhoods, prices of housing to go up. But in the neighborhoods where net payers live, where they receive less in the UBI than they're going to have to pay in taxes, it will bid prices of houses down. And that has good things and bad. The bad thing there is it's making it more expensive for the poorer people, and you might have to index the UBI to do something about that. But the good thing is it's creating an equalization of housing prices, cheaper for the wealthier people and more for them, and people can more afford the housing, so you can have less housing segregation, less ghettoization of poverty, which is a great thing. Now, but you have to do what Eva talked about. You have to have other policies to address the housing issue, such as a tax on the speculative value of housing, where we could pay many of our taxes instead of paying off our housing loan to the bank. That money could be going to the government in payment of our taxes, which would be a lot easier for us. And so there's a lot we can do about housing prices that really has little to do with basic income that can solve that problem.
I'll just make one quick point. And one quick point which mightn't be clear is that I think UBI is basically conceived of as a floor, not a ceiling. So it puts a floor below which you cannot go, but it doesn't stop you earning other income.
I think I was trying to get at the idea of how do we set the level of basic income, because I'm getting the idea that it's a flat level like a pension, but if all this technology is happening, isn't that going to generate enormous wealth, and should it be set as a percentage of national income as opposed to a flat level, and are we creating more inequality by...
Oh yeah, a lot of people suggest tying it to median income or the median wage, so making half of median income or half a median wage or something like that, and something which then is known to be sustainable. And I think that's fine, but I also think you need to also look at an index of a basket of goods that people need, because I believe the basic income needs to be enough that you can live on it and live decently. So it should be indexed to a basket of food, shelter, clothing, transportation, and a cushion above that, so that for miscellaneous needs that people themselves know and that more privileged people are not aware of, so that people can make their own choices. Index it to a basket of that, so we're sure that it is really enough to meet people's basic needs.
I think we've got to that part of the evening where we have to stop. I get the feeling that we could go on for a long time. But look, I just would really like to thank you for being such a terrific audience. I think this is an issue that is going to have a lot more discussion, hopefully, in Australian society. And I would like you to join me in thanking our 4 panellists for a wonderful job. On behalf of ABI, I just want to give them a little gift each. Besides dinner.
Okay.
Thank you very much.